Hello, how are you? I'm Roberto Arirandi, and we are going to continue, dear students, with this course of multiforme financial decision and control from Blackboard Global University within your MBA program. Well, let's continue with this whole world of financial planning and budgeting, and this as a continuation of what we started to talk about within in this last topic. Of course, let us remember that we talked about the objective of the financial manager, which is essentially to maximize the value of the company. We then discussed the three major decisions involved: investment decisions, financing decisions, and dividend decisions. We also addressed the three key financial concepts that are truly present, which are the concepts of profitability, risk, and liquidity, and how these three concepts interact with each other. And we were looking at some examples there of, for instance, how financial leverage impacts both the return and the risk for the business as well as the shareholder. Well, we were there looking at different other concepts. So let's just keep moving forward. This area. So I am going to share the PowerPoint with you all in order to continue progressing a little bit more with our course. So the first thing to say is that financial planning is part of something much broader, which is called strategic planning. And companies have, or should have, right, a competitive strategy that is to set a direction, know what their vision and mission are, and ultimately see how they compete, right? In the market with some generic strategy like differentiation or cost strategy, a niche strategy can also be. And in this context, companies do, or should do, right, an internal analysis of their strengths and weaknesses, but also an analysis of the environment in terms of opportunities and its threats. Based on this, there have been objectives, certain policies, and the areas of the company should contribute to these objectives, plans, and programs. And there, the marketing area, the production area, the human resources area, and research and development have been created. Of course, the financial area, finance is, or should be, the service of the company's competitive strategy. Now, in the first stage of our business development process, what we need to understand is that as the company grows and develops over time, it goes through different phases and stages of evolution. Development over time will generate a certain growth in its short-term and long-term assets, and consequently also in its liabilities and equity. If we look here at an example of this cash flow cycle, which we have already discussed, at some point we see the following. Let's suppose this is an agricultural company. This agricultural company is going to produce only one plot of a product, let's say a product that is harvested in 1 year. To mature and be ready for sale, what needs to be done is to gradually incorporate raw materials, specific inputs, and the wages of the people over time. So we are going to move from raw materials to work-in-progress products until it is finally completed. And only after that will it be able to sell normally on credit, generating cash flow index. The company's process is easy. It needs or requires financing, and it indicates that the company has to think, well, how am I going to finance this shortfall? Am I going to go fast, collect slowly? There are different ways this can be with cash the company has. It can be with lines of credit, or it can be with capital contributions. It is normal for companies such as those in various industries to finance. part of this cash phase with their own funds, and the rest with external bank financing and other similar sources. In this particular case, what will happen is that if the company is financed on an annual basis and if there are no additional credit needs, and as the company begins to expand and grow, what will likely occur is that the producer, while maintaining the same financial parameters, will inevitably require more substantial financing. There are many times when there is significant growth, meaning there is pressure that will allow for greater financing to be generated. Now, what we are thinking is what is happening. It is what we already pointed out in the previous conversation. This cycle represents the flow of money over time. But what happens is that we start with a production sector, we order the materials, these inputs, as well as the invoice, which we will have to pay at some point. We will also have to continuously pay for labor, of course, until that product is finally completed. Once it is finished, we sell the invoice, and eventually we will have the funds available at some point. So, what is behind this? There are different policies. There are inventory policies, payment policies, and credit policies. And this is not just conceptual. We have already calculated some indicators in the financial analysis, right? We calculate inventory days, payment days, and collection days. So this is not only conceptual, but we can also calculate and estimate it accurately based on the financial results. Now, the second stage, as we approach the maximum of our installed capacity, we will also, of course, have fixed or long-term assets, machinery, warehouses, trains, etc. So, what is normal is what is here on the right, that the growth that can be verified with an increase in sales will generate an increase in resources and assets. And if resources increase, the financing needs will also increase. But we also have to remember that a company's total assets must equal its total financing, debt, liabilities, and equity. Then, as assets grow by function, liabilities must also grow. And what happens with companies that are successful is that significant growth is a symptom of success that will pressure us considerably regarding the need for financing. Often, what happens is that a successful company experiences rapid sales growth of 20 to 40% per year, for example. These parameters require more financing, and this necessitates more thought. Not all companies have the capacity to raise or obtain that financing, which can lead to a situation that can be very precarious. Thus, it could be a company that, from the perspective of growth, lacks the liquidity to cope with that, making it solvent, but illiquid. Regarding what we need to evaluate in the administration and management of planning, they might ask us, and how are we going to generate this? This financing is a strategic approach aimed at providing a more comprehensive and organized framework for evaluating and managing the financial aspects of a business operation. It essentially builds upon the initial concept presented at the beginning, which revolves around the idea of a company that is not just growing, but also evolving in a structured manner. Growing, and that this growth implies that one has to consider how it will be done. We have on the curve the total assets of a company, the totals, and these totals are first categorized into two types of assets: permanent assets, which are long-term, current assets which are short term. Therefore, temporary assets are assets that are likely not part of the core business and are virtually temporary. For example, a company that has liquidity. The excessive cash, if the company needs cash for $1 million to operate, and it has cash for $5 million, it has a temporary asset. For example, a company that well-managed resources such as time and opportunity in various sectors, for example, in real estate, and other related areas involve acquiring and managing short-term credit for land effectively. Then we move on to financing, which includes the company's equity, long-term debt, and spontaneous liabilities. The equity and long-term debt are understood, but the question is when you want something to be a spontaneous liability, which is mainly associated with debts to suppliers, accounts payable, taxes owed to the treasury, sales taxes, income taxes, and finally, spontaneous liabilities in a strategic manner and efficiently to maximize benefits and minimize risks in the business environment and financial markets, which are crucial for sustainable growth and development. Since within that, I also missed the third case, which is the liabilities with the workers. So, to recap, permanent financing, equity, long-term debt, and spontaneous liabilities. And within spontaneous liabilities, debt to suppliers, debt to the tax authorities, and debt to employees. Because as the company goes through the month and has not paid the salaries for that month, well, a salary payable accumulates, which disappears when the workers are actually paid that salary. So, what this principle seeks is to organize us from a financial point of view. And here we would have what would be a 100% footwear balance. That is to say, we have there in the balance with a white background the current or temporary circulating asset. And this, in that case, is 100% matched with a temporary current liability. On the other hand, we will have the more permanent assets and liabilities. So there we will have the permanent current asset, which includes the company's cash, accounts receivable, inventory, and all the operations. We will also have the long-term asset, where we have fixed assets and other assets. And on the financing side, we will have spontaneous liabilities, for example, accounts payable, and long-term debt and equity. Now, this is the extreme case, right? A company that is 100% leveraged. The question is, what happens if we have a company that is not 100% operational? Well, there isn't a problem in itself, right? If we are partially barefoot, the problem arises when we are 100% or very barefoot. Okay, because in many cases, the problem of a company is not its level of. Regarding debt, it is that the debt is very unbalanced and is not really about amounts, but rather about structure. Imagine a company that needs to make an investment in a new oven, right? Grow. And that oven, besides being an important investment, will take time to generate the cash flows associated with that increased production and higher sales. Well, what can happen there, right, is that if I finance that oven, that new oven, over a period of 2 years, I will probably be unbalanced. Why? Because it involves a huge investment. And I will never pay it off in 2 years. I will probably pay off that investment in 8 years, 10 years. So there I need a term, a structure, ideally more grace periods, periods during which I will not pay either interest or principal in order to repay. That investment in capex, that issuance in order. So what the principle of equality seeks is precisely to have that order and to have, or at least to seek, that financing that allows us to achieve a balance. So, what is clear is that the variable that will most affect companies is that their financing needs are associated with their expected sales volume. So, if we have more sales, we will have more investment in permanent assets, both short term and long term. And that permanent asset, in turn, what we are saying here is that it would have a correlation with a type of permanent financing as well. And they go in another lane, the temporary assets that they have or should have. One, match with the liabilities that are also temporary. Okay, so this is a structure of order, of planning, because what often happens in reality is that companies end up obtaining any financing without much analysis, without much planning. The idea is to get organized, and the idea is to minimize, never to end up with problems that may arise from this situation. So here we have, on the other hand, a balance again in a stronger blue except for current assets and liabilities. In the case of assets, cash, bank accounts, customers, and merchandise. In the case of liabilities, suppliers, taxes, and short-term banks, the other part is all from the balance sheet, just buildings and machinery long-term assets. And on the liability side, the long-term sources, which are the banks and the company's equity. Well, what do we know? We know that the difference between current assets and current liabilities will be working capital. And it is clear here that many times companies, they have problems with working capital. Why? Because many times they grow very quickly, and that growth in sales does not always match the same speed or capacity as the growth in my financing. So that's where one has to start analyzing this. And as you can see here in this example, that difference between current assets and current liabilities, having more assets than current liabilities implies that there are also long-term resources, alongside the short-term ones that are applied to finance the business operations. So here the same thing, the same balance, this presented only in another nomenclature. Here the NOF model appears. What are operational funding needs? And it is mentioned that we separate there. If you look at the short-term liabilities between spontaneous resources, as we discussed earlier, and short-term financing with banks. So it's a way of looking at it in a broader sense or perspective that way. And here, this concept of working capital needs appears. That is the difference between current short-term assets and spontaneous resources is referred to as these working capital needs, which must be considered in terms of how to finance them. Ultimately, what it shows us is that what we will not be able to cover with spontaneous steps will result in a financial deficit that we will have to figure out how to finance. And the other part, of course, is what we talked about before, right? What we discussed about working capital, the difference between current assets and current liabilities. And ultimately, that working capital is also referred to as working fund. So the model of working capital requirement, the difference between current assets and spontaneous liabilities, and this working capital requirement is financed two ways. With short-term bank financing, credit lines, and on the other hand, working capital is understood as a part of long-term financing. So that said, let's continue here in this course. Moving on to the last session. Next,